You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
And so Vergennes had to make a decision, and Vergennes makes the decision to provide aid, or at least to recommend to his king, Louis XVI, that France provide aid to the Americans. And it was not a slam dunk by any means, because there was debate in the council that considered Vergennes' recommendation, and the French, in effect, Treasury official, Secretary of the Treasury, that wasn't actually his title, but Turgot, said, look, if Britain finds out that we're providing aid to America, it will lead to war, and the first shot in that war will bankrupt France. So it turned out to be pretty good advice in the long run for the French, but Louis XVI sided with Vergennes.
And welcome to episode 432 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Our ideas about the American Revolution often focus on big battles like Saratoga or Yorktown, or on iconic figures like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, or even on documents like Common Sense or the Declaration of Independence, because they help shape the United States and its ideals. With so much to think about when it comes to the American Revolution, it's really easy for us to overlook one of the most important factors in the revolution's outcome: international support for the revolutionaries' cause. With this in mind, why did European powers like France and Spain choose to intervene in the colonists' rebellion? What did these countries hope to gain by entering the fray? And how close did the United States come to losing the war for independence without their help? John Ferling, a professor emeritus of history at the University of West Georgia, and author of Shots Heard Round the World, America, Britain, and Europe in the Revolutionary War, joins us to explore some of the international dimensions of the American Revolution. During our exploration, John reveals how European rivalries and revenge shaped the course of the war for independence, the pivotal but often underestimated role of French diplomacy and naval strategy, and the behind-the-scenes decisions that nearly derailed the American cause more than once. This is the first of a trio of episodes that will allow us to explore the international dimensions of the American Revolution, especially French involvement in the Revolution. Next week, we'll revisit our conversation about the Marquis de Lafayette and his role of support in the American Revolution, and then following that, we'll have a new episode about the role of Saint-Domingue, which is present-day Haiti, in the American Revolution. But first, the History Explorers Club is officially open for membership. If you love early American history, but wonder which sources to trust in an era of AI, misinformation, and agenda-driven storytelling, you're not alone. The History Explorers Club is a historian-led membership for curious adults who want to go from wanting to understand the past to confidently exploring it with guidance, context, and community. Each month, members join live conversations with guest historians, gather for 3 calls with me, and build real skills in our quarterly How Historians Know workshops. And yes, we record everything, so you can keep up even when life gets busy. You can join the club monthly or annually and become the well-informed history person others turn to. Learn more at historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. And I hope to see you there. Okay, are you ready to explore how European politics and ambitions shaped the American Revolution? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an award-winning historian of the American Revolution. For most of his 40-year career, he taught history at the University of West Georgia. He's written 16 books about the Revolutionary era, including Whirlwind, The American Revolution and the War That Won It, which you may recall from episode 46, and, most recently, Shots Heard Round the World, America, Britain, and Europe in the Revolutionary War. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, John Ferling.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to see you again, Liz.
So, John, your new book, Shots Heard Round the World, offers us both a military history of the American Revolution and a political history of the Revolutionary War's international dimensions. And as I looked at your different books, I came to realize that these are really topics you cover quite frequently. So would you tell us what interests you about the Revolution's military and international topics?
Well, I think any war leads to diplomacy, even if it's a conflict between two minor powers. Things ripple out from the war and affect other countries. Somebody might come out of the war as a stronger power, one might come out as a weaker power. Everybody's affected by it. And I grew up in an age after World War II when people look back at the failure of diplomacy in the 1930s, especially to Munich and the appeasement of Hitler. And the feeling was that if the Western countries had stood up to Hitler, World War II might have been averted. So I was always interested in diplomatic history, always incorporated it in my classes, and I was anxious to write a book about it. Obviously, other historians have written about the Franco-American alliance or the peace treaty, but I didn't think that there was a book that really tried to link the war, which goes like a roller coaster in some respects over a long, long period. It was our longest war, in fact, until the Vietnam War. And so I wanted to try to tie the two together, and that was really the origin of shots heard around the world.
Yeah, I think last time we talked about the American Revolution, we talked about how that roller coaster was really a whirlwind of activities because, especially with hindsight, those events seem to happen really fast and one right after the other.
Yeah, I think the war sometimes is ignored, that lots of books have been written about various aspects of the revolution, the coming of the revolution, or this or that aspect of the revolution. But the war is absolutely crucial for winning independence. When independence was declared, John Adams, who was in Congress, said that it would require toil and treasure and blood to win independence. And so the way independence was going to be won was on the battlefield. Just proclaiming it on July the 4th, or actually July the 2nd, I think, is when independence was declared. That's when my wife and I grill out hamburgers and whatever. On the 4th, they approved the Declaration of Independence. But at any rate, I think looking at the war is just absolutely crucial.
Well, since we talked about the war in episode 46, I thought this time we'd focus on the international diplomacy that was taking place around the war. And as you've said, the two topics, diplomacy and war, are really very much linked. What was the international interest in the American Revolution in? Would you tell us which European countries had an interest in the events of the Revolution?
Well, to be sure, France and Spain and Great Britain, I'll toss Great Britain in as a European country, and the United Provinces, or the Dutch Republic, as it was variously called, all had an interest in the American Revolution. And as far as France was concerned, they were interested in the Revolution because they had lost a war to Great Britain, the 7 Years' War, back in 1763, and the French wanted revenge against the British. They had lost a lot of territory. They had lost access to the fisheries, for example, and they felt humiliated by the British in many instances. They felt the British had treated them rather haughtily over the years. The main thing, though, was that the French felt that Britain's possession of the American colonies was what accounted for British power. And the British came out of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in 1763, as the strongest power on the scene. And so the French almost immediately, when they learned of troubles in America, began to think, well, if this leads to the loss of the colonies, we'll be on an equal footing or superior footing with the British. The Spanish also had a huge empire in America. They had colonies in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America. They had lost Florida as a result of the 7 Years' War. And Florida in those days consisted of what they called East Florida and West Florida. East Florida was basically what we think of as Florida today, but West Florida extended all the way to the Mississippi River. So it included what we think of as the lower portions of the states of Alabama and Mississippi. So they had lost a huge area, and that area was something that they had used to sort of safeguard their shipments through the Gulf of Mexico. They were shipping an enormous amount of wealth that they had gained from their colonies in Central America out through the Gulf of Mexico. So the Spanish thought that if things developed into a revolution in North America, that they would have a vital interest in that. And of course, at one time it had possessions in the Mediterranean. They were now in British hands. So again, that led them to think, well, maybe if things go in the right direction in North America, they could conceivably benefit from that. So I think even when the first problems arose between the colonists and the British with the Stamp Act in 1765, in London and Madrid, interest began to be aroused.
And it was a serious interest, too, because something I learned while reading your book, Shots Heard Round the World, is that France, in particular, sent informants to the colonies where the revolution was intensifying to try and figure out what was really going on. So could you tell us about these informants and why France sent them?
The French foreign minister in 1765 was the Duc de Choiseul, and he sent agents over as soon as he learned of the Stamp Act riots in America. And then he sent more agents over a little bit later on in the 1760s. And both sets of agents looked around. Some were down as far south as Virginia. Most of them were around New York and in New England, snooping around and seeing what they could learn. And they reported back that there was probably very little chance of a revolution growing out of this tempest, that the colonies were just in no position to wage a war against the British, so that in all likelihood things would be resolved peacefully. And in fact, for a long time, that's what it looked like, even though there were problems with the Stamp Act and then with the Townsend duties in the late 1760s. By the early 1770s, Thomas Hutchinson, who was the governor of Massachusetts, was writing letters in which he was saying, well, it's all over. The problems have been resolved, and it looks like nothing more is going to come of this. And that was certainly what Lord North, the British Prime Minister, hoped for. I think he was just trying to keep things on a low key and defer any kind of real problem until some other generation came along that could deal with it. But there was an act on the book called the Tea Act, and it really hadn't been enforced. And then the East India Company got into trouble, and starting in 1773, Norse government began to enforce the Tea Act, and that really led to problems in all of the major cities, Charleston and Philadelphia, New York, and especially in Boston, with the result in Boston being the Boston Tea Party. And there is, in a sense, kind of, even though 15 months elapsed between the Boston Tea Party and the beginning of the war, there really is almost a direct link between the Boston Tea Party, which led Britain to pass the Coercive Acts. The colonists defied that with the First Continental Congress, and their defiance led the British in early 1775 to send orders to their commanding general in North America, Thomas Gage, to use force. So that meant war, obviously.
Were the French surprised when the revolution turned to war?
I think they were, and maybe surprised isn't the right word, but they were concerned and they wanted more information. And by this time in 1775, when the war does break out, France's foreign minister is Comte de Vergennes. And Vergennes is going to be the foreign minister. He comes in about 1 year before the war breaks out, and he'll be the foreign minister throughout the war and even into the 1780s. Once independence was gained and Jefferson is sent as an American ambassador to France in the mid-1780s, he'll deal with Vergennes. So Vergennes is the foreign minister when France learns that war has broken out at Lexington and Concord, and he wants more information. So he sends a military officer named Bonvillars over to Philadelphia to meet with Congress. And Bonvillars poses as a merchant, and he landed in Philadelphia in early December of 1775. And he met with a committee of Congress that was called the Secret Committee. And in fact, the meetings were so secret that many of the congressmen didn't realize they were even taking place. Congress was meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, what we call Independence Hall, and the meetings with Bonvillars were in Carpenter's Hall, and they were at night, over 3 different nights, in fact. And so Bonvillars explored whether the colonists could make a war of this, whether they had that capability. And he came away convinced that they could. In his report to Vergennes, he says they have lots of militiamen. They have a Continental Army that's well led by General Washington, and that Congress tells him that they're willing to fight to the last man. And as far as Congress was concerned, they were interested in seeing what France might offer. Of course, Bonvillars said, well, I don't have the authority to make that. I'll go back and report it to Vergennes. And he also told Congress, in the best interest of things, don't send an emissary to Europe, because if you do and London gets wind of that, then the chances increase that France won't provide any help for you. But the Congress ignored what Bonvillars had suggested, and they sent Silas Deane over, and Deane actually arrives in France about the same time that Bonvillars does. But when Bonvillars arrives and makes his report to Vergennes, Vergennes had contradictory reports. His ambassador in London was telling him the colonists don't have a chance in this war. They just can't win it. They don't have the military capability, too many deficiencies, and whatever. And Bonvillars said they do have the capability of winning it if they get help from us. And they need almost everything. They need weaponry, they need munitions, they need clothing. Congress had specifically asked for a couple of military engineers. They need that, Bonvillars said. And so Vergennes had to make a decision, and Vergennes makes the decision to provide aid, or at least to recommend to his king, Louis XVI, that France provide aid to the Americans. And it was not a slam dunk by any means, because there was debate in the council that considered Vergennes' recommendation, and the French, in effect, Treasury official, Secretary of the Treasury, that wasn't actually his title, but Turgot, said, look, if Britain finds out that we're providing aid to America, it will lead to war, and the first shot in that war will bankrupt France. So it turned out to be pretty good advice in the long run for the French, but Louis XVI sided with Vergennes. I think what Vergennes was thinking at this point, he never says so specifically, but I think reading between the lines, Vergennes believed that by providing secret aid to the Americans, that this would prolong the war, and that ultimately might take a year, might take 2 years, might take 3 years, but eventually London would decide that it just wasn't worth it. They couldn't win this war, and that they would set the colonists free. And stripping Britain of those 13 colonies in North America was, at the bottom line, that was what the French wanted.
So what was the sequence of events for getting foreign aid? Did the Americans reach out to the French first, or did the French approach the Americans with Bonvillars to say, we're ready and happy to assist you?
No, it was the French that really initiated it, because remember, when the war breaks out in April of 1775, the goal is not independence. 15 months are going to go by before Congress will declare independence. So there was the majority faction in Congress, led by people like John Dickinson, for example. The majority faction supported the war, but not independence. And they felt that, sort of the same as Vergennes, that if the colonists could keep Britain from winning a major battle, maybe the colonists could win a battle or two, that eventually, within 2 or 3 years, the British would tire of this and they would reconcile with the colonists on Congress's terms, which had been pretty much laid out in the First Continental Congress a few months before the war broke out. The Americans wanted more autonomy. They had to concede some things like control of imperial trade to London. But if the British would recognize the demands that Congress had made, then the two could be reconciled. So rather than appealing to any foreign power in 1775, until Bonvillars comes over right around Christmas of 1775, the Congress appealed instead to George III. And they still looked on George III as somebody who was sympathetic to them and who might intervene and call off the extremists in Parliament and in North's government and bring the two sides back together, mediating this dispute.
Now, a couple of times, John, you've said that the French were willing to provide aid, but they really wanted this aid to be kept a secret from Great Britain. And I know that some of us are thinking, well, why a secret? This is a war. It's out in the open. So could you talk a bit more about the secrecy of supplying the American revolutionaries and why secrecy was important?
The feeling was that if Britain found out about the aid, then they would declare war on France. And the French knew that they weren't prepared for the war. The French Navy had been just absolutely destroyed in the 7 Years' War. Actually, even before the 7 Years' War ended in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the French had begun to rebuild their navy. But that's a long process. This is the 18th century, and they're working with their technology and whatever. The ships were huge ships, and it took a long time to build ships. So almost from the very beginning, the French thought that they would not have a navy that would be capable of challenging Great Britain before 1778. And that turned out to be just about exactly correct. And so they wanted to keep this secret. And I think they probably knew that they couldn't absolutely keep it secret. This is just too big a thing, sending ships across the Atlantic. The British had spies in France. They would know that the ships were being loaded with armaments. When they arrived in the colonies, there were loyalists in the colonies who would pass information along to British authorities about what the French were doing. So they knew that the British would probably know that this was the case. But if they kind of kept it under wraps as secret, then it wouldn't be quite so provocative for London. The British, in the meantime, were thinking that they could subdue the Americans and bring an end to the rebellion pretty quickly. I think when the British went to war in April of 1775, they actually make the decision in January of 75. They thought that one engagement would do the trick, that the notion of militiamen standing up against professional soldiers was just inconceivable. So one battle would probably bring an end to the American rebellion. And of course, that didn't happen. Instead, it's the British that pay really a stupendous price in 1775 on the road back from Concord to Boston on April the 19th, and then again at Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Between those two engagements, the British lose more than 1,000 troops. They lost an enormous percentage of the officers that they had in America and more than 20% of the men that they had in America. So at that point, the British know that it's going to be a longer war, and they begin to increase the size of their army. But they're still thinking that they can defeat the Americans before the French or the Spanish make a decision to intervene. And they did actually have plenty of time. I mean, almost 3 years go by between the beginning of the war and the time that France comes into the war, and about 4 years before Spain enters the war.
It sounds like there were two phases of French support for the war. The pre-1778 secret support for the war, and then the post-1778 open support of the revolution after the treaties of amity and commerce and alliance are passed. So here's our question, John. Many historians of the revolution talk about whether Saratoga was the turning point of the revolution, because many scholars read the American victory at Saratoga as the catalyst for France to enter the war on the Americans' behalf, the not-so-secret entry of France into the war. So was Saratoga the turning point or catalyst for open French support, or was it that Vernier and the French Army and Navy finally had enough time to rebuild after the 7 Years' War so that France could wage its war of revenge against Great Britain and hope for success?
I characterize Saratoga as a turning point, not the turning point. It is a critical event. Obviously, the British lose an entire army under Burgoyne in the two battles of Saratoga. They surrender in October of 1777. So it is an important turning point. But also, I think what happens as a result of Saratoga is that Vergennes, in effect, says, my policy has worked too good, because he expected the British to respond to the loss of this army at Saratoga with an offer of peace to the Americans. And Lord North had offered a peace and had a peace plan in 1775, but it was bogus. And he tells the king in 1775, don't take this seriously. This is designed for public consumption. And he knew that that would be the case because he didn't offer anything. But in 1778, North offered his second peace plan. And essentially what he offered at that juncture was exactly what the First Continental Congress had asked for before the war began. So Vergennes knew that there was now a real threat of reconciliation between the colonists and Britain. If that occurs, then obviously Britain's going to retain the American colonies, and the bottom line of French interest in the war will not be realized. So in a sense, Vergennes is kind of stampeded into an alliance. But I don't want to undersell that. I think that Vergennes at this point realized that while France had to do that in order to prevent reconciliation, he also thought that the colonists would welcome the alliance. And not only would they welcome it, but the combination of French naval power and American power under the Continental Army and through the militia, that their joint efforts could force Britain to relinquish the colonies. Whether Vergennes thought that the Americans would win a great battle, or whether they would just be able to prevent the British from winning a battle, he realized that with France coming into the war in February of 1778 through the Franco-American alliance, that this was going to prolong the war. And he was confident that it would lead to American independence, and so was George Washington. Washington writes a number of letters in early 1778 when he learns of the alliance. In effect, he says this blazes an easy path to independence. And Washington turned out to be wrong in that respect, because a huge French fleet under Comte d'Estaing arrived in America in the spring of 1778, and it was here for 2 years. At least it was here in the summer of 1778. Then it goes to the Caribbean, then it comes back in 1779. But it accomplished nothing. The original design was the fleet would get into New York Harbor, and it would cooperate with Washington, and it would destroy the smaller British fleet that was anchored in New York Harbor, and also it would regain New York, and that would knock Britain out of the war. The French found that their ships were so large they couldn't get into New York Harbor, so that didn't work. They go to the Caribbean, they come back in 1779, and Washington, I think, really wanted them to come to New York and try again with a somewhat different strategy, but still the object was to conquer New York. And instead, D'Estaing was beseeched by Southern authorities, particularly the authorities in South Carolina, to come to the South. And they came to Georgia, to Savannah, which the British had taken in December of 1778. And in 1779, the action of the French fleet was an engagement in Savannah, which turned out to be a disastrous defeat for the Allies. The Americans were there cooperating with them, and both lost heavily. And D'Estaing then sailed back to France. So at that point, at the end of 1779, the French had been in the war for 2 years, and they had nothing to show for it. They had gained a couple of islands in the Caribbean, but by and large, as far as North America was concerned, they had nothing to gain for it. So this brings about really a crisis in France. Does France stay in the war in this situation or not? And there's a good deal of opposition to Vergennes that emerges in 1780.
That was something I found really fascinating about your book, Shots Heard Around the World, that France only sent its navy in 1778 and 1779 to assist the Americans. It didn't send soldiers to support the Franco-American alliance until 1780. Now, this was a really surprising fact for me, so it may be a surprising fact for you. So let's take a moment to let it digest by taking a moment for our sponsors. Thanks for listening to Ben Franklin's World. I care deeply about keeping the show independent because independent history can be careful history. That means history without sensationalism or agenda-driven storytelling. And because we're independent, we can offer you conversations with historians that are grounded in evidence, context, and the curiosity we all share. But independence only works if we build it together. Listener donations help cover the real costs of making this podcast. Research time, editing, and the creation of resources like fact-checked and copy-edited transcripts and show notes that make episodes useful long after release day. So if this podcast helps you make sense of early American history, if it has helped you rethink a familiar story, or introduced you to voices that you hadn't heard before, I'd be grateful for your support. You can donate once or become a monthly or annual supporter at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And please accept my heartfelt thank you, Peter S., Paul A., Jennifer A., April A., Jim A., and Susan A., for supporting this show. Your generosity helps keep Ben Franklin's World going. Thank you so much. John, why did France only send its navy to support the Americans in 1778 and 1789? And what prompted France to finally supplement its naval force with its army in 1780?
I think it was more because they were disappointed in Washington. Vergennes looked on Washington at the time of the alliance in 1778 as a daring, risk-taking commander, which he had been. The attack on Christmas night across the Delaware River and the attack on Trenton and Princeton is as daring as it gets. And after Brandywine, he conducted a surprise attack at Germantown outside of Philadelphia. John Adams was in Paris early in 1778, and Adams writes back and said, in effect, he didn't put it quite this way, but in effect, that it was Washington's daring as much as Saratoga that led Vergennes to want to intervene. But then Washington does not show a daring side. I think Washington did the right thing in 1778 and 1779 by not risking things. He wanted to cooperate with France. If he could have cooperated with France, I think he would have done so. But there was only the Navy, and the Navy wasn't around anywhere where Washington was centered. There were people like Jefferson later on who were beseeching Washington to come to Virginia, but Washington didn't do that. And I think he probably made the wise decision in not doing that. So I think in 1780, there's a huge debate that goes on in France after d'Estaing's failure. And you essentially have about three factions in the argument in France. Vergennes says, let's stay the course and try to win the war in North America. And there was a second faction that, in essence, said the war can't be won in North America. It's got to be won someplace else in the Caribbean, or probably by trying to take Gibraltar. And there was a third faction that said the war can't be won under any circumstances. Let's make a negotiated peace with Britain and get out of this war before it does drag us to bankruptcy and who knows what. So again, there are people like Lafayette who had gone back to France, who's pushing for a commitment of an army, and other people are too, and so is Vergennes, an army, and to send another navy, an even larger navy, over to America. Again, Louis XVI sides with that faction and commits an army under Rochambeau, which will come over in the summer of 1780 and land in Rhode Island, and then to commit a huge squadron of a French fleet that will come over in 1781 under Admiral de Grasse. So that was the decision that was made. I have a soft spot in my heart for Louis XVI. I mean, the poor guy winds up in the French Revolution going to the guillotine early in 1793. But without Louis XVI's support, independence could not have been obtained. And I was always intrigued by Thomas Paine, in many ways intrigued by Thomas Paine. But during the French Revolution, Paine is actually an assemblyman, a member of the French Parliament. And when the debate was conducted over whether to execute Louis XVI or not, Paine said, the better choice is to exile him to America. Let him see what a republic is really like. I think the French missed a good chance in doing that, because if Louis XVI would have been here and if Paine's ideal would have panned out, he would have probably boasted about a Republican government and may have made the future somewhat different in France.
Spain. It sounds like France wanted revenge against Great Britain for its severe losses during the 7 Years' War. It really wanted to see Great Britain lose its North American colonies because France had been devastated in that way after the 7 Years' War. But what did Spain hope to get out of its support for the American Revolution?
Sure, the Spanish and the French were allied. They were both Bourbon monarchies. It was called the Family Alliance because of that. And when Vergennes was preparing to go to the king with the proposal to ally with the Americans in 1778, he first approached the Spanish and said, this is the time. We've got to come in. We're now at the moment where the colonies can be stripped from Britain, and both of us can benefit from that. But in 1778, the Spanish said, no, we're not ready yet. And in fact, what Spain did in 1778 was kind of play both sides. They conducted talks with the British to see what they might get from Great Britain by remaining neutral, and all the while thinking if that didn't pan out, then maybe they would come into the war. And when they were unable to get anything from Britain by remaining neutral, and France was getting more desperate in 1779 because d'Estaing had failed in 1778, then once again Vergennes renewed talks with Spain about coming into the war. And Vergennes told Louis XVI, this is going to lead to extortion. The Spanish are going to really demand the sky and the moon before they come into the war. And sure enough, that was the case. And Vergennes was desperate enough that he had to agree with that. And in the treaty that France and Spain concluded in 1779 that brought Spain into the war, Spain pried from the French concession that they would try to get Gibraltar, which Spain had lost to Britain, and that they would stay in the war until Gibraltar was regained, and that also Spain wanted to attempt an invasion of Britain. They thought that if they landed and had any success in invading England, that the leverage would be that Britain would give back Gibraltar to end the invasion. And I think Vergennes thought that the chances of an invasion succeeding were pretty remote, but he had to agree to that to get the Spanish into the war. And sure enough, the attempt to invade fizzled. Both sides raised large navies, but not a single soldier or Marine landed on British soil in 1779, and eventually the whole thing was called off in September of 1779. And the Spanish tried subsequently to get France to agree to make a second invasion attempt, and Vergennes said, no way, we're not going to do that again. So from that point on, the two really kind of focus on Gibraltar and will eventually attack Gibraltar, but it will be an unsuccessful attack, and the Spanish don't regain it during the war.
I've been to Gibraltar. Tim and I went for our 10-year wedding anniversary, and we went through the bunkers built into this great rock. And once you see the Rock of Gibraltar and how thick the walls are of those bunkers, you really gain a new appreciation and understanding of why France and Spain experienced just a really hard time trying to conquer that place. And they failed in their attempt. They didn't conquer Gibraltar.
Yeah, they imposed a blockade, a naval blockade that lasted for several years, but it was pretty porous. The British were able to run through the blockade and get supplies into the troops that were at Gibraltar. The attack that was eventually made, they actually built grandstands for civilians to come out and watch the attack. A little more ghoulish than I would like, but they did that, and the attack failed disastrously, so they didn't get Gibraltar.
Just to recap, France and Spain supplied the American revolutionaries with war material, with money, with ships, with men, and we haven't even had a chance to talk about the aid in the form of loans and materiel supplied by the Dutch, which also helped to keep this war going. So there was a substantial European assistance for the American Revolution, which kept George Washington and his Continental Army out in the field. So the question now is, when did Great Britain tire of all this European support? When did Britain start to sour on the American Revolution? And did they ever think of offering a peace treaty or a negotiation before the British defeat at Yorktown in October 1781?
Almost immediately after Bonvillard's report early in 76, and then Louis XVI's agreement, which was in the spring of 76, to provide secret aid, then the French government begins to round up the secret aid. They have a fellow who was a playwright named Beaumarchais, who forms a phony company called Roderick Hortalez and Company, and supposedly it's just trading in non-contraband materials. But they began rounding up what they're going to send to America starting in the late summer of 1776. And it took a long time. I mean, this was an age before railroads and airplanes and whatever. So he had to get supplies from a number of different sites in France, transport them to the coast in France. And the first French ship bearing assistance to America doesn't sail until December of 76, and it doesn't arrive in America until early in 1777. So what all of that meant was, in 1776, the Americans were on their own, and they came very close to losing the war in 1776. The focal point in 76 for Great Britain is to take New York. They invade New York, and there's several engagements in New York, and I think the British had the capability of winning the war and crushing the rebellion that year, and they missed the boat. So by 1777, the Americans are still in the war. Vergennes is inspired by Washington's daring at Trenton and Princeton, and those ships began to arrive early in 1777. And before 1777 came to an end, 200 field artillery pieces, 30,000 muskets, and arms and equipment for an army of 30,000 men came over that year. And more would come subsequently, along with outright grants of money and loans by the French government, which the colonists were able to pay off after the war largely by selling Western lands. But even then, Washington wrote a letter either in 1780 or 1781, I can't remember which, in which he says, where is all this equipment that the French has sent over? And I'm not talking about what he got in 1777. He did get that. But a lot of the subsequent equipment wound up in warehouses somewhere and never reached the Army. Part of it was just due to the technology of the time, but a lot of it was due to corruption in the supply system in America. And it led to Washington pulling his hair out before this was over.
In Shots Heard Around the World, you identify several points where the Americans and the British could have defeated each other. So what do you think was the biggest missed opportunity? And I also wonder if you could talk about whether we can only see these missed opportunities because we have hindsight, or whether these missed opportunities were visible in the moment.
I think there were several opportunities for Britain to win the war, not so much for the Americans. The Americans were trying to outlast the British, and until 1781, there really was not too much of a chance. There were a couple cases when D'Estaing arrived, for example. Had he arrived about 2 weeks earlier, the combination of his fleet and Washington's army after the Battle of Monmouth probably would have trapped a British army under Clinton, and the Americans might have won the war then. But otherwise, I think the British had a number of opportunities to win the war. I think they could have won the war at the very beginning if they had had an army of the proper size. And General Gage, Thomas Gage, who was their commander of the British Army before the war began, told London, look, if you're going to go to war, you need a much larger army. We only have about 5,000 or 6,000 men here. You're going to need 20,000, maybe 40,000 men. And if we have an army of that size, then we can absolutely obliterate the American army that we face in the first engagement. And if they had accomplished that, then I think the message would have gone out from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania and South Carolina and Virginia, whatever, that this is hopeless. We just can't defeat the British. And again, in 1776, the British had the Americans on the ropes on Long Island. And General Howe, who succeeded Gage, was in a situation where I think had he daringly attacked the American redoubts that had been constructed along the East River in Long Island, he could have defeated the Americans. But he held back. He chose a naval blockade, and a big storm blew up in August of 76, and Washington was able to use that as a cover to evacuate his army. And after that, I think, beginning with D'Estaing's failure, the war becomes a stalemated conflict. And at that point, I think time becomes a real factor. The British general in command of the British Army in North America after May of 1778 is General Henry Clinton. I think Clinton was the best general that the British had during the war. And if Clinton had been named the commander at the beginning of the war, it's conceivable that Britain might have won the war. Clinton, at least in 1780 and 81, thinks that time is on his side. He's just trying to avoid a defeat. He feels that morale is breaking down in the colonies. The American economy has absolutely collapsed. the French will lose interest in the war. They saw a little while ago, there was this big debate in France in 1780 about staying in the war, but they couldn't stay in the war without some sort of victory. So Clinton thought that time was on his side. And Washington, conversely, knew that time was running out, and I think Vergennes did as well. Louis XVI did as well, and that's when they sent the army over in 1780 and de Grasse's fleet in 1781. But it's touch and go. Then comes Yorktown, and with Yorktown comes the decisive engagement in the war. And Yorktown is, to me, it's absolutely amazing that here you've got American and the French army are in New York. The French Navy is in the Caribbean. They have to rendezvous together to have a successful operation at Yorktown in Virginia. How did they do that? They don't have telephones. They don't have computers. How did they do it? And it's almost a mystery that everything just worked so well. This was a war where almost nothing went according to plan. Almost every military plan, whether it's a British plan or an American plan or a Spanish plan or whatever, goes awry. But in Yorktown, everything just fell together, and it led to the siege of Cornwallis's army and his surrender in October of 1781.
John, we know that the Treaty of Paris in 1783 brought an end to the War for Independence, and that the United States won its independence. It secured its independence. But what did France and Spain win from this war?
Well, France accomplished its major goal, which was to have Britain lose the 13 colonies, which would weaken Great Britain. So they did accomplish that. And they got some territorial concessions, some things in India and even in Africa that had been lost in the 7 Years' War. And they regained their access to the Newfoundland fisheries. And that doesn't sound very important, but the fisheries, that was big business. And lots of money came out of that. And it was also a training ground for seamen who could then go into the French Navy when France went to war. So they were able to regain that. Spain regained Florida as a result of the war, and Spain still held everything west of the Mississippi River. But they didn't get Gibraltar, as we said earlier. They did get Majorca in the Mediterranean. So both sides did accomplish some things. And the Americans, I think, gained two things. You mentioned one of the two. American independence is recognized in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and in the preliminary treaties that the American envoys signed actually in November of 1782. But along with that, the three principal American envoys in the discussions that went on from April until the end of November in 1782 were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. And they get something in addition to independence. They get the Transmontane West. They get everything from the crest of the Appalachians out to the Mississippi River. And that was open to question whether they were going to get that. At one point during the war, Vergennes, he wanted American independence, but he wanted the western boundary of the United States to be at the Appalachians. So America would be a very small nation surrounded by Great Britain. In its weakness, it would be a French client state. But during the negotiations, Vergennes butted out. He didn't try to accomplish that. The Spanish didn't particularly want it. They had interest east of the Mississippi River themselves. But the Americans fought for it, and they got it. And I think it's absolutely crucial for the United States to have gotten that. Not only did they have an enormous amount of territory, but they removed Britain from that area. There can be expansion to the west. A number of states are going to come in. And the result is that the United States will become a reasonably powerful country in the course of the first half of the 19th century that's capable of standing on its own 2 feet.
Well, we should move into the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. John, when we read Shots Heard Round the World, and we also got a sense of this today in our conversation, when we read Shots Heard Round the World, we get to understand that the Comte de Vernier is really important to the American Revolution and its war, that French willingness to aid the United States is because of the Comte de Vernier. So, in your opinion, what might have happened if the Comte de Vernier had not been France's foreign minister during the American Revolution? Do you think France would have still supported the revolutionaries?
I always told my students when I was teaching, it's hard enough to know what happened without trying to figure out what might have happened. But it's a fun game to play. And I think that probably even if Vergennes had not become the foreign minister and Courcelles or somebody else was the foreign minister during the war, I think they too would have provided secret aid. And I think they, in all likelihood, would have allied with the United States in 1778. Probably at that point, the only way to prevent reconciliation and to strip those colonies from Great Britain. But I'm not so sure that another foreign minister would have supported remaining in the war beginning in 1780 and going into 1781. And so that's an open question, I think, and Vergennes did support that, and I tip my hat to him for having done so.
So, John, when I was preparing for this interview, I counted 16 books on the American Revolution. You wrote them all. Are you planning for a 17th book about the Revolution?
Actually, I have a 17th under contract that'll come out next spring. I'm shifting my interest after all these years. I wrote my first book on a loyalist, Joseph Galloway, during the American Revolution, and everything that I've written in the last 48 years has dealt with either the American Revolution or the early Republic, colonial wars, or something along those lines. But I've always been a baseball fan, and I decided that what I wanted to do at my age now, I want to write a book on baseball. And I want to use my training as a historian and the skills that maybe I developed as a writer and a researcher and pitch it toward baseball. So I have a book coming out in the spring about what baseball used to be like. And it looks at baseball basically in roughly about the 15 years or so after World War II in the 1940s and in the 1950s before free agency. It kind of concentrates on general managers. And general manager was like the chief executive officer of a baseball team. And they were the ones that had to put together the team that would take the field. So the book looks at two teams, the Indians, who are now called the Cleveland Guardians, but they were the Cleveland Indians, and the Braves. They were the Boston Braves in the 1940s, then they became the Milwaukee Braves. And the book concludes with them moving to Atlanta in 1965. But it looks at the general managers of those two teams and their ups and downs. So it was a lot of fun doing it.
Fantastic. Now, if we have more questions about the American Revolution or perhaps baseball, is there a place where we can get in contact with you?
Sure. I have a website, and you can just go to johnferling.com, and you can learn more about me than you ever wanted to know, probably.
Well, John Ferling, thank you for rejoining us and for taking us through the international dimensions of the American Revolutionary War.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I certainly appreciate you having me back on, Liz.
The American Revolution was never just a local uprising between the British Crown and its 13 North American colonies. As John made clear, the American War for Independence was a global war, shaped by complex international dynamics and high-stakes diplomacy. France and Spain didn't simply enter into the fray as helpful American allies. They entered into the conflict with their own ambitions, revenge, and strategic calculations. Their involvement dramatically changed the course of the war. France's decision to aid the United States wasn't inevitable. It required persuasive diplomacy from men like the Comte de Vernier and cautious support from Louis XVI, decisions that stirred real fear of bankruptcy and political upheaval within the French court. Likewise, Spain also joined the war with the hope that it would reclaim territory that it had lost during the 7 Years' War, especially Gibraltar, which sits on a small strip of land on the Iberian Peninsula. And yet, even as support for the Americans flowed across the Atlantic in the form of ships, men, money, and war materiel, this support wasn't always reliable. Corruption and mismanagement often kept critical supplies from reaching Washington's army, and French military efforts on behalf of the Americans faltered more than once before contributing to the ultimate decisive victory at Yorktown. As we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, it's important for us to consider how and why the United States achieved its independence. As we heard, the behind-the-scenes struggles and shifting alliances in European aid and support underscore just how precarious the outcome of the war and the revolution truly was. Could the Americans have emerged victorious without this European aid and support? That's a good question for you to think about. Look for more information about John, his book, Shots Heard Round the World, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/432. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Ben Franklin's World is a member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what do you think? Do you think the United States would have achieved its independence without international support? I'd love to know what you think, so let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.